Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo estás? Welcome back to Spanish Lessons with Professor Jason. Recently, I uploaded an overview of the most common and useful verb tenses in Spanish. In that lesson, I did briefly talk about the distinction between the subjunctive and the indicative moods and provide several examples of their various forms. But what I want to do today is to elaborate a bit more on that distinction and provide an overview of the kinds of syntactic structures and semantic contexts that require the subjunctive mood in Spanish. Now, since I've already uploaded lessons covering the present and past forms of the verbs in the subjunctive, this lesson won't focus much on teaching you how to conjugate in the subjunctive. But you'll still see plenty of examples of subjunctive verb forms, obviously, particularly in the present subjunctive. So, the main purpose of this lesson is to give you a better understanding of what the subjunctive mood is and when it should be used in Spanish. Now, unlike in English, in which the subjunctive constructions and forms have become pretty rare, Spanish speakers consistently distinguish between the indicative and the subjunctive moods. It's a distinction that actually affects not only meaning, but how verbs are conjugated, what the actual verb form looks and sounds like, okay? Just to provide a quick example to get us started, we can see that the first person singular or yo form of the verb hablar has both an indicative form and a subjunctive form in the present tense. Here's an example. Yo hablo español. Ella quiere que yo hable francés. Quiere que hable francés. Okay? Now, even a simple example like this one can tell us a lot about what the subjunctive is and when we may need to use it. Notice that the first sentence, Yo hablo español, is very simple in terms of its structure, right? There's only one subject involved. We have just one clause with a single subject, verb, and object. However, the second example, right, Ella quiere que hable francés, is clearly more complex. We now have two clauses, a main clause, ella quiere, followed by a dependent or a subordinate clause, que yo hable francés. So now we have two different subjects and two different verbs involved in two different clauses. Okay? Another thing to notice in terms of the differences between these two sentences has to do with the kind of meaning they convey. In the first example, yo hablo español, I'm making an assertion of fact, telling it like it is, so to speak. Okay? I'm describing what for me is objective reality. However, the meaning of the second sentence is very different. It refers to what someone else wants me to do. So, while the first clause, ella quiere, may be true enough, the second clause, que yo hable español, actually refers to an action or an outcome that is anything but real, true, or certain. Okay? Since I don't speak French, she does want me to, but I don't. Okay? And we have no way of knowing if I ever will. So, the subjunctive in this case is being used to mark that this action is unrealized or uncertain, has not occurred yet, may never occur. And actually, if we look closely, it's the nature of the verb in the main clause, the first verb, that tells us this. She wants me to do something. Okay? The meaning conveyed by the main clause verb is crucial in determining whether to use the subjunctive in the subordinate clause, the second clause. If, for example, instead of to want, we were to use to know, all of a sudden everything changes and we're back to the indicative mood, because to know conveys a sense of certainty or truth about what's being asserted. So look at these two examples. Ella sabe que yo hablo español. She knows that I speak Spanish. Versus ella quiere que hable español. Or que hable francés, excuse me. So, what we've seen so far is that when deciding whether to conjugate verbs in the indicative or subjunctive moods, there are two major things to consider. First, the structure of the sentence, whether it's a simple single clause sentence or a more complex dual clause sentence. And secondly, when we have a more complex sentence with two clauses, two subjects, and two verbs, we have to consider what kind of meaning the main clause verb is conveying. What does it say about the subordinate clause it's introducing? So let's take out the whiteboard and get a closer look at both of these aspects, sentence structure and the semantics or meaning. All right, now the sentence structure that most often generates the subjunctive can be represented by a formula that would look something like this. We have a first subject plus a first verb. Then we have the word que, followed by subject to and verb to. Okay, so S1 plus V1 plus K plus S2 plus V2, right? This is a formula that represents the syntactic structure that generates the subjunctive most often. Try to remember three elements that are crucial here. First, we have two distinct clauses, okay? Two distinct clauses. Second, they are joined, or the second clause is always introduced by the word que. And then third, that we have two subjects, and this is key, two different subjects heading each of those clauses. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at a few examples that illustrate this structure again. Okay, let's take a look. Here's one example. She wants me to speak French, the example that we've already looked at already. Ella quiere que, right? Yo hable francés. Okay? Ella quiere que yo hable francés. So we can see that structure, that formula being played out here. Another one. Yo espero que tú me llames, and excuse my handwriting, más tarde. Más tarde. Okay? Espero que tú me llames más tarde. So we have yo espero que tú me llames más tarde. Okay? Couple more. Felipe prefiere que nosotros comamos ahora. So in each of these cases, right, we have a main clause verb, right, a main clause verb that's actually conjugated in the indicative. And we have que, and then we have our subordinate clause verb, which is the one that's being conjugated in the subjunctive. All right, let's do maybe two more examples. Javier, don't ask me where I come up with these names. Javier duda que tú tengas, and I'm not writing all the personal pronouns here. Javier duda que tengas dinero, shorthand for money. Javier duda que tengas dinero. So again, we have subject one, we have a second subject, which is tú, right? We have the verbs in each clause separated by que, all right? And a final example, Julia teme, she fears. Julia teme que, then we need a second different subject, sus padres. Julia teme que sus padres no comprendan. So typical of youth today. No comprendan su problema. And they probably do. We should just give them a chance. Julia teme que sus padres no comprendan. So main clause verb in the indicative actually. Clause introduced with que. Second subject. Subordinate clause verb in the subjunctive. Julia teme que sus padres no comprendan su problema. Okay, notice that in all of these examples, again, we have two clauses with two distinct subjects, okay, and that we have a change in subject between the clauses. Now, when there is no change in subject, even if we have two verbs, we're not going to usually see the subjunctive, right? I might say, yo quiero dormir. Okay? We don't have a change in subject. Both verbs apply to the same subject, to me. Quiero dormir. So I'm just conjugating the second in the infinitive. Or something like, Antonio prefiere ver otra película. Okay? Antonio prefiere ver otra película. Again, we have more than one verb, but we only have one subject. Right? There's no change in subject, which is sort of one of the syntactic conditions for the subjunctive to occur. All right. Now there is another similar syntactic structure that also often results in the subjunctive. And now I'm talking about impersonal expressions. Impersonal expressions. Okay. The formula here is something like form of the verb ser. S, we're just stay in the present tense, plus an adverb that usually goes in the blank here. Again, our friend que, And then we introduce a clause with its own subject and verb, the verb being in the subjunctive if conditions dictate. Okay, so what goes in this blank, right, are adverbs, things like es bueno que, es importante que, es mejor que, es difícil que, es dudoso que, es lamentable que. There's many common impersonal expressions in Spanish that will trigger the subjunctive. Just to give you 3 quick examples of common ones. Es importante que, now we have our subject and verb, right? Es importante que tú estudies. Es importante que tú estudies, for example, this weekend. Importante que tú estudies este fin de semana. Or, es increíble. I'm trying to write fast because this is going to be a really long video. Es increíble que, and then we introduce our subject, José hable, verb in the subjunctive, 3 idiomas. Es increíble que José hable 3 idiomas. Okay? So this part here is an impersonal expression. Okay? We don't have that first subject we talked about. Or another common one, es mejor que. It's best, or it would be best. Es mejor que ellos no insistan. It's a way to give advice. Es mejor que ellos no insistan, our verb form in the subjunctive. Another fairly common impersonal expression that always triggers the subjunctive is the term or phrase ojalá, which comes from the Arabic, ojalá or ojalá que. Okay, for example, ojalá que ellos lleguen temprano. I'm writing kind of crazy, but I'm also speaking it, so hopefully you can follow along. Ojalá que ellos lleguen temprano, verb in the subjunctive. Ojalá literally means something like God willing, that, right? You can translate it as I hope that, right? Ojalá que ellos lleguen temprano. Or you can also use it without the que. Ojalá haga buen tiempo mañana. Ojalá haga buen tiempo mañana. Okay? I hope it's nice weather. I hope we have nice weather tomorrow. Ojalá haga buen tiempo mañana. So ojalá or ojalá que also is an impersonal kind of expression that always triggers the subjunctive. And finally, in terms of impersonal expressions, we could talk about the impersonal, oops, my spelling is atrocious today as usual, impersonal se kinds of constructions. Things like se pide a los invitados, okay, se pide a los invitados que, remember we have to have the que, se pide a los invitados que, and then our verb in the que confirmen su asistencia, right, that they RSVP. Que confirmen. Se pide a is an impersonal expression. There's nobody actually doing it. Se pide a los invitados, or we're not stressing who's doing it. Or se recomienda que, right? Se recomienda que, por ejemplo, los pasajeros lleguen 60 minutos antes del vuelo, right? It's recommended that, or they recommend that. Passengers arrive. Que lleguen 60 minutos antes del vuelo, before their flight. Now, assuming we're talking about these kinds of dual clause sentences, we still have to consider the nature of the meaning conveyed by the verb in the main clause. The question we have to answer again is, does the main clause verb convey the kind of meaning that requires or triggers the subjunctive in the subordinate clause? I'm going to provide a fairly comprehensive list of semantic contexts that do in fact trigger the use of the subjunctive, but first let's take a look at the general distinction between what's being communicated when we use verbs conjugated in either mood. Now notice that I did say general distinction. Turns out that the semantics of the subjunctive are actually not that easy to classify in a neat, all-inclusive kind of way, right? There are always going to be exceptions or uses that don't seem to fit into a particular description. Okay, keep that in mind. There's always exceptions, and people do explain this in different ways. But in general, Use of the indicative mood indicates that speakers mean to designate actions, persons, places, objects, ideas, etc. as being part of their real lived experience. Actions that are completed or habitual, and persons, places, and objects that are real and definite. The indicative coincides with narrations and descriptions of real, lived experience and direct knowledge and assertions of fact, truth, objectivity, and certainty. On the other hand, use of the subjunctive mood indicates that speakers mean to designate actions or the characteristics of persons, places, objects, or ideas as being unrealized, meaning that they have not yet occurred, uncertain, hypothetical, unlikely, subjective, indefinite, or non-existent. It's a means of signaling that these things fall outside of reality as far as the speaker personally knows and experiences it. Now, I realize that all that might sound a bit too abstract to remember or apply. If it does make sense for you, great. But I think a better way to wrap your brain around when to use the subjunctive is to focus on and to be on the lookout for certain kinds of meanings that coincide or require its use. What I'm going to be calling subjunctive trigger categories. Okay? So what I intend to do from here on out, the rest of the video, is to go through a list of those categories, accompanied by plenty of examples of individual trigger verbs. Okay? Those are the main clause verbs whose meanings trigger the subjunctive in the subordinate clauses. Because here's the thing. I think that if you see enough examples and review them often enough and focus on the trigger verbs, you'll start to develop a pretty good sense of when to use the subjunctive mood in your own speech and writing. Okay? So, here we go. The first major subjunctive category or trigger category is comprised of verbs that convey will, influence, or persuasion. Some instructors call this volition. And remember, when I talk about trigger verbs, I'm actually talking about the verb in the main clause, the first verb in that formula we saw earlier. The trigger verbs will actually be in the indicative, but they cause the verb in the next clause, the verb after the word que, to be in the subjunctive. So, here are some of the more common verbs in Spanish, not a comprehensive list, but more common verbs that convey the idea that one person, subject of the first clause, wants to persuade or influence the behavior of the subject of the second clause. So these are ideas like to want, to desire, to need, to prefer, to hope or expect, to recommend that someone does something, to suggest someone does something, to ask or request, to tell in the sense that I tell him to follow or she tells her to do something, okay? To order someone, to insist on, to allow, to prohibit, to impede. You can see those in Spanish there. Okay, so here are some examples of subjunctive clauses resulting from trigger verbs that convey will, influence, or persuasion. Okay, now in most of these examples that we're going to see in the rest of this video, I've put the trigger verbs or the trigger expressions in white with the subjunctive forms underlined. Okay, so let's take a look. Quiero que tú hagas la cama. I want you to make the bed. ¿Necesitas que pasemos por ti? ¿Necesitas que pasemos por ti? Do you need us to pick you up? Julio prefiere que María lave la ropa. Julio prefers that María wash the clothes. Espero que vengas a verme. I hope that you come to see me. Again, one person's hoping that another person performs a certain action. Mis padres sugieren que estudie medicina. In this case, the subject of the second clause is yo. Que yo estudie medicina. Les pedimos a los turistas que no saquen fotos. Les pedimos a los turistas que no saquen fotos. Notice the spelling change on the form of sacar, saquen. El profesor siempre les dice a los alumnos que estudien. Or, mi jefe insiste en que lleguemos temprano. So remember, like most of the examples we'll see, the first verb, the main clause verb, has a meaning that triggers the second clause, causes it to be in the subjunctive. Okay, a second major category of main clause verbs that trigger the subjunctive are those that convey doubt, uncertainty, or denial. Expressions like dudar, to doubt, negar, to deny, no creer, to not believe, no pensar, to not think, no estar seguro de que, to not be sure about. Let's take a look at some examples. Dudo que ganemos el partido. I doubt that we'll win the game. Juan niega que el tratamiento sea necesario. He denies that the treatment is necessary. Paco no cree que Laura lo quiera. pero Laura no piensa que Paco esté interesado en ella. So in all of these, we're expressing some type of doubt, uncertainty, or denial of what comes in the second clause. No estamos seguros de que ellos aprecien el esfuerzo que hacemos. We're not sure. We can't say with a certainty. Okay? No estamos seguros de que ellos aprecien el esfuerzo que hacemos. Now, there are also several related impersonal expressions that convey doubt, uncertainty, and denial. And really, you can make impersonal expressions that reflect all the categories we're going to talk about. So take a look at some of these with doubt, uncertainty, and denial. Es imposible que no sepas la letra de esa canción. It's impossible you don't know the lyrics. Es posible que tengamos que abandonar el proyecto. Es posible que tengamos que abandonar el proyecto. So both impossible and it's possible that convey a lack of certainty. Es probable que los clientes rechacen la propuesta. It's probable that the clients will reject the proposal. Es increíble que ese ejecutivo gane tanto dinero. Es increíble que ese ejecutivo gane tanto dinero. I can't believe it, right? In this case, I might be conveying doubt or denial, or it might be a subjective reaction, which happens to be the next category. No es cierto que ella trabaje tantas horas. Here I'm denying, right? Stating that something isn't true. No es cierto que, it's not true that. There's another expression, no es verdad que, okay? And also when it comes to this category, keep in mind that using verbs that actually convey certainty results in the indicative being used in the subordinate clause. So if we are conveying certainty rather than uncertainty, then we're going to use the indicative, as in these examples. Yo sé que estudias todas las noches. Pablo cree que su amiga tiene 20 años. So, no cree que is subjunctive. Cree que, or creo que, or creemos que introduces the indicative. Estamos seguros de que ellos viajan mañana. Estamos seguros de que ellos viajan mañana. We're sure that they travel tomorrow. Es cierto que, remember we just saw no es cierto que it's subjunctive, but es cierto que hace mucho calor allá. It's true that it's very hot there, so we're expressing certainty. Okay, a third major category of main clause verbs that trigger the subjunctive are those that convey emotional or subjective judgments about what's being said. Things like, it's pleasing to me that, or I don't like that, or it pleases me that, someone's glad about something, se alegra de que, to be afraid of something, temer, to be sorry about something, like in the expression, siento mucho que, I'm very sorry that. Sorprender, if something surprises the speaker surprised about something, or if the speaker is worried about something, preocupar, okay? Here are some examples with some of those expressions then. Okay, a Hans le gusta que Ana aprenda alemán. He likes that. A Hans le gusta que aprenda alemán. No me gusta, it doesn't please me, I don't like the fact. No me gusta que cambies el canal cuando estoy viendo el partido. No me gusta que cambies el canal cuando estoy viendo el partido. I don't like when you change the channel when I'm watching the game. Mi tía se alegra de que la visitemos todos los veranos. Mi tía se alegra de que la visitemos todos los veranos. She's glad that we visit her. Okay, she's expressing we're expressing a subjective reaction. Mi colega teme que nuestro jefe lo despida. He's afraid our boss will fire him. He's afraid. Teme que. ¿Te sorprende que todos sepan que te casaste? ¿Te sorprende que todos sepan que te casaste? Are you surprised that everyone knows that you're married or that you got married? Nos preocupa que Jaime pierda su dinero en el casino. Nos preocupa que Jaime pierda su dinero en el casino. We're worried that he will lose his money in the casino. And as we saw with the last category, there are also several impersonal expressions that are frequently used to convey emotional or subjective judgments. For example, es mejor que nos callemos. It's better that. That's subjective. Es bueno que tengas tanto interés en el medio ambiente. It's great that you're so interested in the environment. Es triste que ya no pasemos tanto tiempo juntos. Es triste que ya no pasemos tanto tiempo juntos. It's sad that we don't spend as much time together anymore. It's sad that requires the subjunctive. It's a subjective or emotional statement. Es lamentable que no puedas viajar con nosotros. It's too bad that you can't travel with us. So these are impersonal expressions which the speaker is emitting some type of a subjective or emotional judgment on what comes next. Now, a fourth semantic category that involves the subjunctive mood relates to the use of adjective phrases that modify indefinite or non-existent nouns. Okay? Now, I like to call this the classified ad or personal ad's use of the subjunctive because it's typically used when speakers want to describe an indefinite person or object they're seeking. So it's a bit like saying, man seeks woman who doesn't smoke, or woman seeks man who likes long walks on the beach. Okay? Or newlyweds seek small apartment with 2 bedrooms. Right? The subjects know what they want, but the actual person or object being sought is indefinite in the sense of being as yet unidentified and thus not known to actually exist. Okay? Let's look at some examples. Okay then, these are going to be examples of adjective phrases that modify indefinite or non-existent nouns. Things that we're not sure whether they exist out there or not. First one, necesitamos un carro que tenga un maletero grande. So we need a car that has a large trunk. Buscamos un barrio que no esté muy lejos del metro. We're looking for a neighborhood that's not too far from the subway station. Obviously there is one out there, there are such neighborhoods, but the one that we haven't identified, it's not definite. Okay? Procuro un apartamento que tenga 2 habitaciones. Queremos viajar a un destino que sea remoto y exótico. Haven't determined which destination, but I do know I want it to be remoto y exótico. Okay? Tenemos que contratar a un vendedor que hable francés. Don't know who we're going to hire, but he or she has to speak French. ¿Hay alguien aquí que sepa bailar salsa? ¿Hay alguien aquí que sepa bailar salsa? Is there anyone here that knows how to dance salsa? Alright, now adjective phrases that modify known or definite persons or objects don't take the subjunctive. So in contrast to what we saw in the previous slide. Mis padres compraron un coche que tiene 4 puertas. So we know what car they've bought. It's now a definite object. Okay? It's a definite item. Compraron un coche que tiene 4 puertas. So I use the indicative. Encontré un apartamento que está cerca del centro. So I did find an apartment that is close to downtown. I know which apartment it is. Mi hermano tiene una amiga que habla italiano. Indicative because I'm referring to a definite person, a definite friend of my brother's. Now the subjunctive mood is also used when the existence of persons or objects with certain qualities is being ruled out or denied. We're saying that these things don't exist. For example, no hay nadie que cante mejor que Ana Lucía. No hay nadie que cante mejor que Ana Lucía. I just made her up. Fictional singer. Do not Google her. No hay nada más que podamos hacer por él. There's nothing more we can do for him. No hay ningún hotel que tenga un cuarto libre. So there is no hotel that has a free or available room. So I'm ruling these things out using the subjunctive to say that they're non-existent. Subjunctive use category 5 involves a group of adverbial conjunctions that always require the subjunctive. So in a sense, this category is one of the easiest ones to master because the list can be easily memorized, the list you're seeing on this slide. And these expressions always trigger the subjunctive, no exceptions. So if you have these expressions with the que, you're always going to have the subjunctive in the clause that follows. Para que means so that, or in order to, in order for. A fin de que, same thing. A menos que, unless. Antes de que, obviously before. Sin que, without. En caso de que, in the event that, and con tal de que, as long as. Here are some examples with those expressions. Voy a comprar ese libro para que estudiemos inglés, so that we study English. Podemos almorzar con Viviana a menos que tenga que trabajar, unless she has to work. Something that we don't know is unrealized, etc. Tenemos que limpiar la casa antes de que lleguen mis padres, before my parents arrive. They haven't arrived yet. It's an unrealized action in the future, specific instance. No te vayas sin que me despida de ti. No te vayas sin que me despida de ti. Don't leave without my saying goodbye to you. Llámenme en caso de que necesiten un lugar donde quedarse. Call me if, or in the event that, you need a place to stay. Right? It's an unrealized action. We don't know if it will actually materialize or not. Llámenme en caso de que necesiten un lugar donde quedarse. Finally, podemos ver un video con tal de que yo escoja la película. Podemos ver un video con tal de que yo escoja la película. So, as long as I get to choose the film. Now, there's another group of adverbial conjunctions that's a bit trickier to master in terms of using the subjunctive or the indicative, because they can also introduce the indicative. So our sixth semantic category to look out for involves adverbial conjunctions of time. These all deal with time that sometimes require the subjunctive. Okay. Now the following, the expressions on this slide, will trigger the subjunctive when they're used to introduce a specific future instance of an action that obviously has not yet occurred. So we have cuando, when, después de que, after, hasta que, until, mientras in the sense of while or as long as something is happening, en cuanto and tan pronto como, which both mean as soon as. Here are some examples with those expressions. Llámenme cuando tengan más información, por favor. So they don't have the extra information, but when they do have information, they're going to call. ¿Cuándo vamos a almorzar después de que termine la clase? Vamos a almorzar después de que termine la clase. So we're talking about a specific class that we're in right now, and when it's done, or after it finishes, are we going to have lunch together maybe? Alicia tiene que cuidar a su sobrina hasta que su tía regrese. So we're not talking about in general, we're talking about this time. Hasta que su tía regrese. But the aunt hasn't come back and may not come back. That's the idea. Has to be subjunctive. It's an unrealized action. We hope she comes back. Ellos van a esperar a su madre mientras haga las compras. Van a esperar a su madre mientras haga las compras. While she, or as long as she's shopping. Until she finishes, basically. Mientras trabajes aquí, debes cumplir todas las normas. Mientras trabajes aquí, debes cumplir todas las normas. So as long as you work here, you have to keep all the rules. Voy a salir en cuanto llegue mi hermano. So I'm going to leave as soon as my brother gets here. As soon as. He hasn't gotten here yet, but as soon as. En cuanto llegue. As soon as he gets here, I'm leaving. So most of these refer to a future action that will happen when, while, after, right, something else happens, or as soon as something else happens. If these same types of conjunctions of time are used in ways that describe people's habitual activities, what they customarily, usually, generally do, then the indicative mood is used instead. For example, nunca me acuesto temprano cuando estoy de vacaciones. Nunca me acuesto temprano cuando estoy de vacaciones, describing usual conditions. Siempre almorzamos, that's the key word, siempre, we always. Siempre almorzamos después de que termina la clase. Generalmente la llamo en cuanto llego del trabajo. So here I'm talking about, usually, generally, I call her as soon as I get home from work. Cuando tengo tiempo, estudio mientras trabajo. So here we have both cuando and mientras, but both being used in a customary general to describe what I habitually do. When I have time, I study while I work. Okay? And finally, there are a few other adverbial conjunctions that sometimes, in that tricky category, sometimes require the subjunctive. We have aunque, which means although, even though, or even if. De modo que, in such a way that. And como, which really can mean different things depending on the context, such as if, however, or like. We'll see in the examples. So as with the group we just saw, the conjunctions of time, right, on the previous slides, whether the expressions in this group introduce the verbs conjugated in the subjunctive or in the indicative depends on whether they refer to specific unrealized actions or, on the other hand, to habitual or completed actions. So here are some examples of these expressions being used in the, or triggering the subjunctive mood. Vamos a comer en el parque aunque llueva. So even if it rains, we are going to have our picnic. Tienes que comprarle el regalo aunque sea caro. I don't know if it is expensive, but even if it is expensive, you have to get him that present. Quiero explicarles esto de modo que lo comprendan. I want to explain this in such a way that you will understand it, or they will understand it. Arréglalo de modo que no se estropee de nuevo. So you're telling someone, fix it in such a way that it won't break or won't break down again. Arréglalo de modo que no se estropee de nuevo. Could be a car or something like that. And then in Spain and some other Latin American countries, for example, some people used como to introduce the present subjunctive in the sense of if. Como me mientas ahora, nunca más voy a creerte. Como me mientas ahora, nunca más voy a creerte. So, if you lie to me now, I'm never again going to believe you. Or, haré la tarea como el profesor diga. Here it means more like, I'm going to do the homework the way the professor wants it done. Como el profesor diga, the way he says or she says. Okay? All right, now here finally, this is our last slide. We have examples of those same expressions, aunque, de modo que, and como, being used in the sense of the indicative, okay? Because we're describing something that's completed or something that's habitual. First example is that, a habitual action. Aunque sale a tiempo, Rodrigo siempre llega tarde. So, even though he leaves early, he leaves on time, he's always late, describing usual conditions. Ese autor escribe de modo que nadie entiende nada. So he writes in a way, in such a way that nobody understands anything. That's not his purpose, that's just the way he writes. Finally, hice la tarea como el profesor quería. So I did the homework the way the professor wanted. In this sense, it means like, right? Like the professor wanted. And I'm describing a completed action, not an unrealized action, which is why I'm using the indicative, past tense here, the imperfect. All right, that's going to be a wrap on my overview of the subjunctive and the structural and semantic conditions that require its use in Spanish. I hope you found it to be helpful and informative, and as always, I welcome your comments, questions, and suggestions. So, if you do have a moment, please leave a comment and let me know what you thought about this video lesson. If you liked this video, I hope you'll check out my other lessons on various topics in Spanish and Portuguese. You can also find more content at my website at professorjason.com and receive even more frequent Professor Jason updates by joining my Facebook community or by following me on Twitter. And I'll go ahead and put that information up on the screen here in just a second. Thanks again for watching. This has been Professor Jason, your guide to Spanish, and I'll see you at the next lesson. Hasta pronto. Ciao.